Hey, listeners, are you interested in free theological training? Midwestern Seminary exists for the church, and that vision to be for the church is the reason that they provide free resources for anyone who wants to grow in their faith. How do they do that? Through the For the Church Institute, which offers free seminary-level education to any individual interested in growing in their knowledge of Scripture, knowing the Lord more deeply, and discerning their calling in ministry. With courses ranging from New Testament and theology to the doctrine of the Trinity, find out if the For the Church Institute is the right solution for you to deepen in your knowledge of Christ. Go to mbts.edu/FTCI. Again, that's mbts.edu/FTCI for the Church Institute. And while you're there, let them know that the Missions Podcast sent you. And now, on to our show. Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media with ABWE, joined once again, as always, by Scott Dunford, pastor of Western Hills Church in San Mateo, California. And you are you, and we're so glad that you're here. Before you leave, if this show is a blessing to you, we ask that you would be so kind as to leave us a positive rating and review in whatever podcast app you use, but especially Apple Podcasts. That helps other people be encouraged by this content and discover it. And Scott, almost to 40 missionaries in the last reporting cycle I'm seeing are people who found out about this organization through the podcast. So we're not just talking about people that decided to drop $5 in the tip jar. We're talking about people who have gone out for the sake of the name, in part because they were encouraged by something that they heard here. And we rejoice so much in that. It's incredible.
Well, yeah, I mean, we thought, hey, if we got 40 listeners, we'd be excited. And to think that there's 40 people serving with ABWE because of the podcast kind of blows our mind. So anyway, that's really exciting.
Well, speaking of people with podcasts that they thought would only start with 40 listeners, I want to introduce our guest in a moment, who's also a host of his own show, along with several other arguably more impressive credentials. But before we do that, Scott, it's story time.
Yeah.
And a few nights ago, we were putting our children to bed. Our middle daughter was a little bit afraid and having some nightmares. And so we started singing a song to encourage her and to embolden her. And it's kind of a sea shanty. And it's about the Lord being on our side. Well, there's this line in the song, and she's singing along, and it's this wonderful family time. Honestly, singing songs together as a family is such a glorious thing to do. But there's this line of the song that says, we'll be sharpening the axe to cut down old Donner's oak, for the Lord is on our side. And that idea of cutting down old Donar's oak, my kids are like, who's Donar? Why are we chopping down his tree? What's going on here? And we got to share a story with them that many of our listeners may know or may not be aware of. I don't want to spoil that because I don't want to take away any thunder from our guest here, thunder, pun intended. And with that, let me introduce our guest. Dr. Glenn Sunshine returns for the third time to the Missions Podcast. He is the author of multiple books, most recently 32 Christians That Changed Their World. He also leads Every Square Inch Ministries. He's a retired European history professor from Central Connecticut State University, serves with ministry called Reflections Ministries, and as a fellow for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and also hosts each week the Theology Podcast, which goes over worldview and philosophy and culture. And Glenn, we're so glad to have you back on the show.
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's set this up. Glenn, I want to hear from you. We were talking before we started recording about this issue of not knowing our history and missions history in particular. You were even teaching a course recently that placed the start of missions in the 19th century. It seems to me that for many evangelicals, that's kind of a big gap in the literature, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's surprising how little people consider. If you're thinking about missions beginning in 1800, the question is, how did the gospel get to England when they sent William Carey out? How did it get to the Americas? How did it get to the rest of Europe? I mean, Christianity had spread for a very, very long time across continents and across cultures before 1800. So why don't we ever talk about that?
Well, because that's Catholic. If we talk about that, we're all going to become Catholic and have to go to Rome, right? So, I mean, I think that's probably the reason why we don't. You know, we love to talk about Christian history, kind of beginning with Martin Luther and the Wittenberg Door, but certainly that's not the case, right?
Well, why don't we talk about then Protestant missions in the 16th and 17th century? Because there were some.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I'm just being tongue in cheek, but I think that's the rationale, right?
Yeah, I strongly suspect that's the case, but there are some problems with that on a whole bunch of different levels.
So give us a little bit of an overview. This is your area of study. You weigh in on things of relating to theology and culture, but European history in particular, and this period of history, especially the medieval period, is your specialty. So honestly, for those that are ignorant, what is happening in the medieval period and even earlier on in terms of Christian mission? I think we do look to William Carey because there are some things in church history that are unique and new and different about that maybe weren't happening in the same way in other missions movements in the past. And so that's not a bad starting point, but sketch out for us some of the things that we can look to earlier in church history and be encouraged in our missionary endeavors.
Yeah, well, about William Carey, I should note that although he has some incredibly significant failures in his life, he is a guy I admire to no end in terms of what he did. So I am certainly not dissing William Carey. The guy was incredible. But, well, the fact of the matter is that Christianity, according to, well, it's legendary accounts in the sense that we don't have written accounts, but these stories go far back where, well, apostles evangelized in Armenia. Thomas made it to India. We know by the 5th century, Ethiopia has converted to Christianity. Armenia was the first kingdom to do so, then Rome, then Ethiopia. Up until the year 1000, there were more Christians, roughly, there were more Christians outside the boundaries of the old Roman Empire than inside it. So when you look at the Orthodox world and the Catholic world, combine both of those together, there are more Christians. Actually, there are Christian communities all across Central Asia, actually major centers of scholarship and learning. The first Christian missionary to arrive in China was a guy named Alepen in the early 600s. And he established a church in China that continued to flourish for about 200 years when it was exterminated. Christianity was reintroduced again later. It was there for about 200 years when it was exterminated. Then it was reintroduced in the 19th century, and this time it won't be exterminated. Because unlike the previous times, it actually went indigenous. You know, the earlier ones, it was a lot of what we would call expats, perhaps, were really at the core of the church. But they're still doing this mission work in China starting in the 600s. There were Mongol tribes that had converted to Christianity, Turkic tribes that had converted to Christianity. Genghis Khan, when his family was murdered, he fled to a nearby tribe, the Karaites, another Mongol tribe. The Karaites were Christians. Kublai Khan's mother was a Christian. You know, and that's just the Asian side of things.
Right.
When you go to Europe, what you see is, okay, now there is a common misconception that I've heard quoted by people who really ought to know better, that Christianity spread basically by conquest. That's true of Islam. It's not true of Christianity. The only example I can think of this happening through the medieval period was an attempt by Charlemagne to do it with the Saxons. And the situation there was that the Saxons had raided into his territory in the Netherlands, burned some churches and so on. So Charlemagne sent a reprisal party in, burned down the pagan temples there. And this started a lengthy war, lasted 32 years, where Charlemagne was trying to subdue the Saxons. And at one point, he forcibly baptized Saxons and made reversion to paganism a capital offense. Now, that particular fact is known. And especially among the pagans, they like to cite this as an example of the brutality of Christianity. Of course, ignoring the fact that they went and started it. But the other side of this that most people don't know, the other half of the story that isn't told, is that Charlemagne's main theological advisor, a guy by the name of Alcuin of York, actually told Charlemagne, you can't do that. Forced baptism is not legitimate baptism. They are not real Christians if they have not been baptized voluntarily. And so this entire attempt at forced conversion is just simply wrong. And so Charlemagne actually rescinded the decree. You always hear about, people who talk about this always talk about the first half. They never note that he rescinded it because of his theological advisor's rebuke.
Fascinating.
Paul Harvey's rest of the story, right, Scott?
So the point being that Christianity did not spread by the sword. And so the question then becomes, how did it spread? And that's really, in a lot of ways, the story of late antique, early medieval mission, and then some of the stuff that's going on during the Middle Ages itself.
So maybe you could help us with that, especially as we're thinking about missiology and methodologies. What are some of the ways that period differed in the way that they were doing missions, but also, what are some of the specific theological shifts that were certainly influencing that period of time?
First of all, one of the situations that's radically different is that the early church structured itself, even before it was legalized, it structured itself following the political structure of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was set up around city-states. These city-states controlled the surrounding rural countryside. Also, in pretty much all cultures in that period, communities were led officially or unofficially by a group of elders. And in fact, the word Senate, like the Roman Senate, comes from the Latin word senex, meaning an old man. It's the council of elders in principle, or at least in origin. So what happens in the church is, what do? Well, they set up a church structure that's led by elders with deacons in support. The senior elder is named the bishop, the overseer. This may be reflected, this is a little bit of an exegetical side note, this may be reflected already even in the pastoral epistles, because the word episkopos, or bishop there, is always used in the singular, where presbyters are in the plural. So it may be that early. So, but what happens then is that the senior bishop, or the senior elder, the bishop in the city, oversees not just the city, but the surrounding rural countryside, the churches there, because that's the way the city-state was structured. Then you move to provinces and things like that, and you end up with what eventually will be called archbishops and patriarchs. This is how the system grows. And the reason why that's important, the structure is important, is that once Christianity is legalized by Constantine, or to be more precise, decriminalized, a side note, Constantine didn't make Christianity the official religion of the empire. All he did was follow, early Christians argued for religious liberty, because they said worship of God that is compelled is not pleasing to him. So you must have religious liberty. That's, that was their conclusion already in the 2nd century. And we see this with Alcuin and Charlemagne later. What Constantine did is he used the Christian arguments about religious liberty, and in the Edict of Milan, he declares religious liberty in the empire. That has the effect of decriminalizing or legalizing Christianity, but it wasn't specific to Christianity. Later, Theodosius I will, in fact, make it the official religion of the empire, the imperial religion, but he still allows paganism because they believe in religious liberty. But nonetheless, once Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, it tends to spread through all the provinces, through the governors, through so on. So it works its way through the empire initially that way. What then ends up happening, and this is where the story gets really interesting, actually. What then ends up happening is, as Roman authority in the western half of the empire collapses, Roman administration falls apart. The only ones left standing are the church. So the net result, the bishops end up taking on administrative duties that they never had before, because somebody has to do it, and they're the last men standing. So they're going to start doing that kind of thing. And then as the so-called barbarian successor states, especially the Franks and others, develop, they're going to be incorporating church leaders into the administration of the state. And this is a recipe for corruption. The fact of the matter is, it's not clear to me how thoroughly Christianized the empire had been before it collapsed. But at this point, what largely ends up happening is it becomes very corrupt and very nominal. The exception, however, is over in Ireland. Ireland was a territory that Rome never conquered. Rome had considered invading Ireland, but when their merchants came back and sort of reported what was there, they decided it wasn't worth it. There was nothing there that they wanted, and the people were likely to put up a heck of a fight. So they just decided not to bother with it because there was nothing there that was worth having. Well, Patrick ends up in Ireland. I'm not going to go through the story, but Patrick ends up leading a movement of Christian conversion in the country as a missionary. And he is sent specifically as a missionary bishop. Now, Irish Christianity then develops following very different rules from the continent. What happens in Irish Christianity is, well, you have to go back to pre-Christian Ireland. In pre-Christian Ireland, the pagan religion was headed by Druids. But in order to be a Druid, it took literally several decades of study and work. You had to master everything that there was to know about the culture. You needed, of course, religion and ritual and magic and all of that kind of thing. But you also needed to know history, legends, mythology. You also needed to know poetry, law, on and on and on. Virtually everything about the culture you were expected to know. This is why it took so many decades to become a Druid. When Patrick arrives, interestingly enough, some of the first people to convert are Druids. And I think the reason for that is that I can't prove this. I have no sources on this. But I suspect the reason is that Celtic religion included human sacrifice. And I think Patrick's message probably went something along the lines of, your gods ask you to sacrifice your sons to them. The true God sacrificed his son for you.
Mm-hmm. Contextualization.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about, we've got contextualization. We also have indigenization. What happens when Christianity gets into an Ireland that has this history of pagan religion of the sort that they had with the Druids and so on? They naturally assume that in order to be a holy man, in order to be a priest, you need to know everything there is to know about Christianity and the culture that produced it. Now, the problem here is that the Irish didn't write. They didn't have, they had a rudimentary written language, but they never used it for anything important because they, probably like the Native Americans, they believed that if you write things down, it starts to die. It's only alive when it's kept in your living memory. But now they had to learn the scriptures. They had to learn all of the things that are associated with Christianity and with that, frankly, Roman culture. And they had to learn it in Latin using a language that they didn't know, or Greek or Hebrew. And in that period, all of those languages were written as an unbroken string of letters with no capitalization, punctuation, or word spaces.
Right.
So the Irish took a look at this and said, too hard. And so they started doing things like introducing word breaks to make it easier for them to read, introducing basic kinds of punctuation and capitalization, and in the process, turned reading from a secondary form of learning to a primary form of learning. And they threw themselves into this so fervently that Ireland became known as the island of saints and scholars. Now, they also, so Ireland becomes this center for learning and education when it's largely collapsed in Europe. And you've got a lot of people who are very, very serious about their faith at a time when Western Europe is really pretty dead in terms of real Christianity. Now, the Irish had a practice that they called peregrinatio. It's the Latin word for pilgrimage. And for them, that meant frequently unplanned wanderings wherever God sent you with the expectation that you would never return home, a permanent exile. You can think of this like the 19th century missionaries who used to pack their goods in their coffin. because they never expected to come back. They expected to die in the mission field. This is the sort of thing that they were doing.
Yeah.
Many of these made their way to the continent and began to re-evangelize this nominally Christian territory with a much more serious vision of the gospel. I can tell you, if you're interested, I can tell you some of the stories, but there are many Irish saints that are commemorated across Germany and across Europe because of them coming in and essentially taking a very nominally and corrupt Christian culture and revitalizing it.
So let me make sure I'm understanding you correctly. Are you saying that pilgrimages, as understood originally in the Irish church, were really mission efforts?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
And really revitalization efforts, which is encouraging to people out here in California and the East Coast where you are. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. They, for them, being a peregrinus, a pilgrim, meant that you were going wherever God sent you to do his work. We have examples, records of people arriving on the coast of Wales, for example, in boats without oars or sails. And they were Irish monks who got into the boat and prayed, God, send us where you want us. We're not going to interfere. And the currents brought them to Wales, so they figured Wales was where they were supposed to serve. Now, not all of them were quite that extreme, but that's the kind of, that looking at the extreme gives you, I think, an idea of the general trend of what they're trying to follow. Wherever God sends us, that's where we're going to go.
Right. These are not imperial efforts. These are much closer to what we look at as characterizing missions and missionary efforts in the modern period.
Yeah, right. Well, let me give you a concrete example, probably my favorite. A guy by the name of Columbanus. Actually, it's kind of stuck between Columbanus and Columba. Let's start with Columba. Columba leaves Ireland as an exile and goes to an island off the coast of Scotland in the Inner Hebrides called Iona. He establishes a mission base there, and from there, he evangelizes Scotland, which had never been evangelized before. It was called Pictland in those days. And from there, the Irish will evangelize Scotland, turn it Christian. They will establish another monastery at Lindisfarne, known as the Holy Island to this day. And they will then push south into England, establishing or reestablishing churches at places like York and elsewhere. And all of this is evangelism efforts coming from a guy who was on a peregrinus. And many of these people peregrinatio. And many of these guys considered themselves on peregrinatio as they went out to do this kind of work. The other example is Columbanus. Columbanus, without going into his background, he ended up being the teacher at a monastery in Bangor and believed at about the age of 40 that God was calling him to go on a pilgrimage. The abbot wouldn't let him go. He said, I need you here. Columbanus approached him a few years later, and the abbot allowed him to go with 12 followers. They got into a boat and sailed to Carnac in Brittany, France. From there, they began a preaching tour where they preached across northern France, and frankly, astounded everybody that ran into them. Because what they were people who took their faith absolutely seriously and lived a very stringent ascetic lifestyle. But they were full of learning, they were full of education, they were preaching, they were teaching, all of these kinds of things. Eventually, they got into the territory of Burgundy, where the king there, a guy named Gontram, gave them a ruined Roman fortress at Annagray to start a monastery. And once they did this, now monasteries were at the heart of Irish Christianity. Rather than a bishop in a cathedral, it was the monasteries. Once they established the monastery, people from all walks of life started to flock to them. So much so that Gontram had to give them a couple of other locations, most notably a place called Luxeuil, in order to start additional monasteries. Now, the local bishops are really upset with this because he's upstaging them. And they called him, now on the continent, the bishops are supposed to oversee the monasteries. It's the opposite in Ireland. They called Columbanus to a conference and to set him straight and basically try to get control over him. His reply was, I'm sorry, I'm too busy doing God's work. Maybe you should try it. That didn't go over well with the bishops. He actually ended up writing a letter to Rome, which is much more polite than my summary of it. Basically, he said, look, these bishops you got out here are a bunch of bozos. They're not doing anything. This is your responsibility. You need to straighten these guys out. So he is absolutely fearless. He's afraid of nobody. Unfortunately, he ended up annoying the royal family by criticizing their loose morals. Maybe he should have learned a lesson from John the Baptist here. But the queen mother, a woman named Brunhilde, yes, she's the one that we associate, all the names that are associated with Brunhilde come from her, Wagner and all of that. She was the prototype. She decided she couldn't just off these guys, which is what she usually did. But she did say, okay, we can exile them back to Ireland. So she had them stuck on a boat and shipped upriver in the Rhine on their way back to Ireland. But a storm came up and the ship was driven aground. The ship's captain basically said, all right, look, you guys are a bunch of Jonahs. Get off my boat. So they got off the boat and they began another preaching tour down the Rhine. This time they made it into Switzerland, where there was a ruined Catholic church that had turned into or Christian church that had turned into a pagan shrine complete with idol on this lake. And so they ended up blowing a trumpet or whatever, calling all the people there. And remember, the Irish are great scholars. One of them actually knew the local language. And he preached a sermon to them about Christianity, and they grabbed the idols in the former church, threw them in the lake, and reconsecrated the church.
Wow.
Columbanus later got into more political trouble there. The guy who knew the local language stayed. He crossed the Alps, went to northern Italy, where he was invited to set up a monastery by the Arian king of Lombardy to try to bring Orthodox Christianity into the region. So he set up a monastery at a place called Bobbio.
So for our listeners, just so we're paying, unlikely bedfellows, right?
Yeah, very unlikely bedfellows. By the way, his followers' name was Gaul. And so the province of Sankt Gallen in Switzerland is named after him, because that's where it happened. And all of these places become major centers of learning and education, which end up revitalizing Christianity on the continent and end up helping to set up the Anglo-Saxon missionary Boniface to come in and begin evangelizing in the Low Countries.
Yeah, let's set that up. That's what we were teasing at the very beginning of the episode. And so let's have the payoff now with that. But also, if we can just make this explicit, what we're doing here is we ought to refer to this period of time, from roughly the fall of the Roman Empire to the dawn of the Reformation, not as the Dark Ages, but as the medieval period. Even that assumes certain things, but so often we think of them as Dark Ages. And were things great by all accounts? Certainly not. There's things, of course, that we would look at and see how the Lord has blessed society at large, and yet the light of the gospel is being carried forth, and that influences us today. And even with Boniface too, I think there's lessons for us today in terms of how bold we ought to be.
Yeah. Now, medieval historians divide the period up into three periods: the early Middle Ages, which in England is called the Dark Ages. And by that, they mean we don't have a lot of written records from the period, so it's historically dark. It's not a value judgment. It's just we can't see in there. We don't have the written records. Then you have the Central Middle Ages, which runs from roughly 1000 to roughly 1300, and then the Late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500. That's the way they normally break it up. We've been dealing here almost entirely with the early Middle Ages.
Right.
Now, in Britain, you have the Celtic church coming down from the north, which at this point is not really under the authority of the Pope. It's technically what's referred to as autocephalous, a self-headed church. As a matter of fact, this was even acknowledged as late as the 1200s by the Pope. He said, you need to, he's told the Normans in England, you need to bring the Irish under our authority. Okay. So yeah.
Theologically, were they more in line with Roman, what we think of as Roman theology?
Of the period, yeah, they were pretty close to it. But you have to understand that what we think of as Roman Catholicism, when you're dealing with the early Middle Ages, it doesn't really exist.
Right.
You've got some people making claims early on for papal authority, for example, but that doesn't really become a strong thing until about the 11th century. The Pope isn't making the exaggerated claims to authority until then. A lot of the doctrinal things aren't developed. You don't have a lot of the Marian doctrines, things like that. They're just simply not in place. It's a different kind of church than what we see today. But you do have Pope Gregory the Great, who is a guy that's actually worth knowing. His book on a pastoral rule is, I think, every Christian leader ought to read it. I mean, there's a lot of real wisdom in there. Pastoral care, that's what it's called. But Gregory sent missionaries into England. So they're coming up from the south while the Celts are coming down from the north. And Gregory's instructions to the missionaries are really interesting because he's explicitly arguing for something like contextualization. What he's saying is you shouldn't go in and just destroy all the pagan shrines and sanctuaries and put up churches somewhere else, because this is where people are used to going for worship. Instead, convert the shrine into a church. Put your churches where the shrines are, because this is where people go to worship. And by doing this, you'll be able to more effectively reach the people. In essence, this is something, again, that we see in a lot of places, particularly in Northern Europe. You see a very direct effort to say, look, take the culture's beliefs, take the culture's practices that are compatible with Christianity and build on those, work with those. So you see these early arguments for contextualization going on with Gregory. He sends people in from the south, notably Augustine of Canterbury, and they begin establishing churches connected to Rome. They collide in an area called Northumbria, where you have the Celtic and the Roman churches. They've got some differences in practice. For political reasons, the king of Northumbria decides to go with Rome. And so the Roman churches have, they start following Roman practices in those areas. But nonetheless, there's still a strong Celtic influence there. You're still seeing the emphasis on education and all of those things still being pushed, particularly in the northern churches. Alcuin, Charlemagne's theological advisor, whom I mentioned earlier, was the deacon and teacher at York, a Celtic church, Celtic foundation. So Boniface is coming out of this environment where, yes, he's associated with the Roman Church, but he's heavily influenced by these ideas from Celtic Christianity. And he's got a very, very different way of looking at things than many of the people coming out of the continent. He goes on his own equivalent of a peregrinus, although in his case it's authorized, and he is sent into the Low Countries, into the Netherlands, to try to evangelize the pagans there. And among other things, Boniface was a no-holds-barred evangelist. I almost wanted to use "take no prisoners" here. And at one point, and this was probably planned out ahead of time and announced that this was going to happen. We don't know for sure, but I would pretty much bet on it. He announced that he was going to chop down the sacred tree to Donar, or Thor, the god of thunder. The Norse call him Thor, the Germans call him Donar. Okay, so, and so he, one day he went out and there was a crowd around and he took an axe and chopped down the sacred oak of Thor, basically saying, all right, think about Gideon. Think about Gideon. When Gideon tears down the altar and the people say, take him out, we're going to kill him. What does his father say? He says, let Baal contend for him. He took down Baal's altar. Let Baal deal with it. And of course, Baal didn't deal with it. He's doing the same kind of thing. He's chopping down the oak, really, maybe also like Elijah, as a direct challenge to the pagan gods to, okay, this is your sacred oak. What are you going to do about it? And you know what? Lightning didn't come from the sky. He wasn't struck down by a thunderbolt, and he chopped down the oak. And the people said, maybe what he's telling us is true. And the region begins converting to Christianity. He will ultimately, by the way, end up being martyred during a pagan raid into the area. But he is taking this sort of active role in confronting the spiritual forces that are at work in the area and taking them on head on in this chopping down of the oak. This is not, you will note, a very winsome approach to evangelism, but it was effective.
No, this is taking every thought captive.
Now, another interesting one, it involves the conversion of the Vikings. And I won't go through all the history here, but King Olaf I of Norway does in fact convert to Christianity. A young Leif Erikson visits his court. He converts to Christianity. And Leif Erikson is sent back to convert his father, Eric the Red's colony in Greenland, to Christianity. And this is the context. He was actually on a missionary trip when he was sort of blown off course and landed in North America. But one of the interesting things you see in Norse Christianity is they use pagan myths as a doorway for the gospel. You know, the early church would say things like, you know, the philosophers are the Greeks' road to the truth, best expressed in Christianity, just like the prophets were the Hebrews' road to the truth, best expressed in Christianity. You know, so you see this use of the things from Greek philosophy that were useful being brought in and used to explain the gospel to the pagan world. They do the same thing in the Scandinavian countries with the Norse myths. And the root of this is the legend of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. At Ragnarok, there is a great war between the gods and their allies and the giants and the monsters. And basically, they all wipe each other out. The only ones that survive because there's this tree known as Yggdrasil. That is it's the world tree. It ties all of the worlds together. Its roots are in the underworld. It goes through Middle Earth and all that into the heavens. And Yggdrasil opens its doors and admits two of the younger gods, or a few of the younger gods, and two humans in. And after everything else is destroyed, Yggdrasil opens up and releases these new gods and these new people into the world to start a new world. Okay, that's the story of Ragnarok.
Yeah.
The Christians came to the Norse and said, Ragnarok has already come. The gods have been defeated. The monsters have been defeated. And Yggdrasil is the cross. And it is through the cross that we enter the new world. And so when you look at Norse churches, they actually there are, you know, the ironwork on the doors actually depicts frequently, if you know what you're looking for, scenes from Ragnarok. And the famous stave churches in Norway, which are built without nails or anything like that, they're incredibly beautiful pieces of work. They have a central pillar in the middle. And when you take a look at them from the outside, they're sort of shaped like trees. They're sort of shaped like pine trees. So the tree, the church represents Yggdrasil, the world tree, that is actually the cross that you have to enter to get new life in the new world.
It's beautiful.
That is, you know, it's an incredible example of contextualization. I mean, even using the pagan myth, they found ways to introduce the gospel into that culture.
There's so much here that we need to get into. And what we'd actually like to do, Glenn, if you're okay with this, we want to give our listeners a week to just wrap their minds around the richness of what God was doing, especially in this early medieval period. And we'll come back to it in a week. For us, though, it'll be just a few minutes. We want to split this conversation into two parts, and we'll move to part two here for our listeners. Again, it'll be a week from now. For us, it'll be in just a few moments and continue recording. But we want to talk about application of these things than lessons that we can see today, and even ways in which later missionary efforts, are they building on things that happened in the past, or were these things totally forgotten until 2023 when Dr. Sunshine brought them to our attention? And so we're going to do that in just a moment. And if this show is an encouragement to you, remember to share it with a friend, leave a positive rating and review in your platform of choice. You can get more content at missionspodcast.com, where you can also support the show by hitting the support tab at the top. And you can also learn more about serving in mission, in God's mission yourself, by going to abwe.org. And we'll see you in our next episode, in the second part of our conversation with Glenn Sunshine.